The instruments were screaming, not metaphorically. The cardiac monitor beside bed 4 had been shrieking for 11 seconds before anyone in the OR noticed that the surgeon's hands had stopped moving. Dr. Harrington was on the floor. He'd gone down between one breath and the next. No warning, no dramatic clutch at his chest. Just a slow sideways collapse that knocked the instrument tray and sent a stainless steel retractor skidding across the tile. The scrub nurse, a woman named Colleen who had worked 22 years in that hospital, said later that she thought he'd simply tripped. That was how quiet it was. That was how fast everything changed. On the table, the patient's chest was open. His name was Leonard Hobart, 53 years old, a retired high school shop teacher from Sudbury, Ontario. He had driven 7 hours to Toronto General for this surgery, a triple bypass that his cardiologist back home had been recommending for 2 years. His daughter had taken the week off work. His wife had packed a bag with his favorite crossword books and a thermos of the coffee she made him every morning, the kind with too much sugar that his doctor told him to stop drinking. Leonard Hobart had arrived at the hospital at 6 in the morning. He had shaken the hands of everyone in the room. He had made a joke about being nervous, and everyone had laughed. And then the anesthesiologist had done what anesthesiologists do, and Leonard had closed his eyes. That had been 40 minutes ago. Now the surgeon was unconscious on the floor, and Leonard Hobart's heart was bypassed and clamped, and being kept alive by a bypass machine, and there were exactly 14 minutes before the window for completing the anastomosis would begin to close. The OR resident, a third year named Dr. Pauline Achibi, was the first one to say out loud what everyone in that room was already thinking. Someone get cardiothoracic on the phone now. It took 4 minutes to reach anyone. Dr. Achibi had her hands inside a man's chest cavity, maintaining pressure on tissue that could not be left unattended, and she was shouting instructions across the room while Colleen dialed and redialed, and the monitor kept screaming, and the bypass machine kept humming its low mechanical hum that meant, for now, Leonard Hobart was still alive. The on-call cardiothoracic surgeon was in a car somewhere on the Gardner Expressway, 20 minutes away, minimum. They had 14. Now they had 13. Outside the OR, down the corridor, past the bank of staff lockers, in the narrow supply room that the surgical technicians used as a de facto break room, because it had the only decent coffee maker on the floor, a man named Elio Ferreira was eating a sandwich. He was 34 years old. He wore green scrubs that were slightly too large for him, the drawstring double knotted at his waist. His hands, when he wasn't eating, had a habit of moving, tapping rhythms on his knee, tracing invisible shapes on whatever surface was closest. His colleagues had noticed this over the years. Some found it odd. Most had stopped noticing entirely. Elio Ferreira was a surgical technician. His job was to prepare and maintain surgical instruments, ensure sterile fields, and assist in the OR during procedures. He was, in the official hierarchy of that hospital, somewhere below the residents and well below the attendings. He wore green scrubs instead of the blue ones the surgeons wore. He did not have a title in front of his name. He had no medical degree on any wall. What Elio Ferreira had was 11 years of surgical experience, a photographic memory for anatomy, and a habit of reading operative technique journals the way other people read hockey scores. He had started in this hospital at 23, straight out of a 2-year surgical technology diploma at a college in Hamilton. He had grown up in a neighborhood in East Hamilton, where the closest thing to a medical career most kids saw was the paramedics who came twice a month to the apartment building on his street. His father had worked in a steel plant. His mother had cleaned offices overnight. Elio had paid for his diploma in 3 installments and had taken the bus to Toronto for the job interview because he could not afford the train. He did not talk about any of this at work. There was no reason to. People had their assumptions about who he was based on what he wore, and Elio had long ago decided that correcting those assumptions was not his job. His job was the instruments. His job was the field. His job was to be invisible until he was needed. He was halfway through a ham and Swiss on rye when Colleen pushed open the supply room door. She did not look at him when she came in. She looked past him, checking to see if there was anyone else in the room. There was not. "Elio," she said, "come." He was already standing up. He'd seen open-chest procedures before, had assisted in hundreds of them, standing at the instrument table, passing tools to whoever was cutting, watching every move with the careful attention of someone who knew they would never be allowed to do it themselves. He knew the anatomy of the human heart the way a stage carpenter knows the architecture of a theater, from the wings, in the dark, through repetition and observation, and the kind of knowing that comes from being present without being seen. What Elio had never done was step into the primary surgeon's position on a procedure already in progress with 13 minutes on the clock. 12 now. Dr. Achibi looked at him when he entered. The room was not silent. The machines were all still doing their respective things, but it had the particular quality of silence that comes when everyone has stopped pretending they know what to do next. "Elio," she said, "talk to me." He looked at the field. He looked at Leonard Hobart's open chest, the clamped vessels, the grafts that had been partially placed. He looked at the bypass machine readings on the monitor to his left. He looked at Dr. Achibi's hands. "Where did he get to?" Elio asked. "Second graft. Left anterior descending. He'd placed the proximal anastomosis but hadn't started the distal." Elio nodded slowly. "Okay, one of the other technicians in the room, a younger man named Felix who had only been on the floor 8 months, took a step backward. Not away from the table exactly, just backward. The way you move when you're not sure what you're witnessing." "He can't," Felix started. "He's not doing anything yet," Colleen said without turning around. There was a flatness to her voice that Felix understood was not an invitation to continue. Elio pulled on fresh gloves. He moved to the table. He looked at the field the way a man looks at a problem he has been thinking about for a long time and has finally been given permission to solve. "The on-call is 20 minutes out," Dr. Achibi said. 12 minutes left in the window," Elio said. She met his eyes. She was 31 years old and had 4 more years of training ahead of her before she would be a qualified cardiothoracic surgeon. She knew what she knew, and she knew what she didn't know, and in that moment she was performing a calculation that no textbook had ever prepared her for. "Walk me through what you're going to do," she said. He did. He described the distal anastomosis in technical language she understood completely. The angle of approach, the suture placement, the tension management, the sequence of steps. He did not hurry. He was precise in the way that people are precise when they have rehearsed something in their mind so many times that saying it out loud is simply a formality. When he finished, Dr. Achi was quiet for 3 seconds. "Okay," she said. It took 9 minutes. Later, much later, in the review that the hospital's quality committee would conduct, in the conversations that the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario would have, in the deposition that the hospital's legal team would request. People would argue about what exactly happened in that OR and what it meant, and who bore responsibility for what. But in the room, in those 9 minutes, there was only the field and the instruments, and the sound of the bypass machine, and Elio Ferreira's hands, which had stopped tapping rhythms on his knee, and were now moving with a steadiness that Colleen, who had seen 22 years of surgery, would describe to her husband that night as the most precise thing she had ever watched in that operating room. Leonard Hobart's heart, when the clamp came off, began to beat on its own. The hallway outside the OR had filled up by the time the doors opened. News travels fast in hospitals, not through official channels, but through the version of telephone that exists in every institution where people spend 12-hour shifts together. By the time the procedure was complete and Leonard Hobart was being transferred to the ICU, and Dr. Harrington was conscious in a bed 2 floors up with a suspected arrhythmia, and a very serious cardiologist standing over him, roughly half the surgical floor knew that something had happened in OR 3. What they knew, or thought they knew, varied considerably. The version that reached the charge nurse at the nursing station was that a tech had done something during an emergency. The version that reached the resident lounge was that a scrub tech had finished a bypass. The version that reached the attending surgeon, who appeared in the hallway 22 minutes after the procedure ended. The on-call cardiothoracic surgeon, who had been sitting in traffic on the Gardiner, was delivered by Dr. Achi herself, standing in her gown with her hands still gloved. And it was the clearest and most precise version, because Dr. Achi had a gift for precision. The attending's name was Dr. Stuart Nguyen. He was 48 years old and had been doing cardiothoracic surgery for 19 of them. He listened to Dr. Achebe without interrupting, which was something he was not known for. When she finished, he looked at Elio, who was standing near the instrument table doing the post-procedure inventory with the focused, unhurried attention he brought to everything. "You completed the distal anastomosis," Dr. Nguyen said. "Not a question." Elio looked up. "Yes, you're a surgical technician. Yes." There was a pause. In the pause, Felix, who was still in the room, took another small step backward. "Show me your hands," Dr. Nguyen said. It was an odd request. Elio looked at him steadily for a moment, and then held up his gloved hands. They were still. They did not shake. Dr. Nguyen looked at them for several seconds in the manner of a man who is updating a significant assumption. "My office," Dr. Nguyen said. "After you finish the inventory." Elio had been called into the offices of senior staff before, though not often and not recently. The last time had been 3 years ago, when a new attending had complained that Elio was overstepping by pointing out, correctly, that a particular instrument had not been properly sterilized. The meeting had lasted 7 minutes. The instrument issue had been quietly acknowledged. Elio had gone back to work. He had learned early that the best way to exist in a hospital as a surgical technician was to be invisible without being visible, to know more than you were supposed to know, and to use that knowledge only in the service of the people who wore blue scrubs and carried stethoscopes around their necks like identity documents. He had learned to offer suggestions as questions. He had learned to let corrections arrive sideways, in the form of double-checking rather than challenging. He had learned the particular grammar of deference that allowed a person to be excellent in a role that no one expected excellence from. He sat in the chair across from Dr. Nguyen's desk. On the wall behind the desk were framed degrees, 3 of them, arranged with the specific intentionality of a person who had worked very hard to put them there. "How long have you been here?" Dr. Nguyen asked. "Toronto General?" 11 years. "And before?" "Hamilton General." 2 years. "You've worked with Harrington's team for how long?" 4 years. Dr. Nguyen wrote something on a notepad, though Elio could not see what it was. "Harrington's going to be fine, by the way. Paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. They're sorting out his medication." "Good," Elio said. "The patient, Hobart, is stable. ICU is monitoring him." "Yes." Another pause. Dr. Nguyen set down his pen and looked at Elio the way people look at things they thought they understood and are now reconsidering. "Where did you learn to do what you did today?" Elio considered the question. It was not as simple a question as it sounded. "Watching," he said. "Reading. I've assisted in over 800 cardiac procedures. I've read operative technique literature since my 2nd year at Hamilton General. I do it at home mostly." He paused. "I'm aware that this is not the same as training." "No," Dr. Nguyen agreed. "It is not. I wasn't trying to practice medicine," Elio said. "There was a man on the table with an open chest and a closing window and no qualified surgeon in the room. I made a judgment call. I would make the same judgment call again." Dr. Nguyen was quiet. "The outcome was good," Elio continued. "I know that doesn't settle the other questions." "No," Dr. Nguyen said again. "It doesn't." He stood up. He walked to the window, which looked out over a narrow courtyard where a single bench sat in the late afternoon light. Someone had left a coffee cup on the bench. It had been there for 2 days. Elio had noticed it from a different window on a different floor. "I'm going to have to report this," Dr. Nguyen said. "You understand that?" "Yes!" "The college will have questions. Legal will have questions. There's a process." "I know. You could lose your certification." "I know that too." Dr. Nguyen turned from the window. He had the look of a man who is aware that the rules he is citing exist for good reasons, and who is also aware that good reasons don't always produce good outcomes. You saved his life, Elio. Elio said nothing. I need you to understand that I can say that and also mean everything else I just said. I understand, Elio said. That's what rules are for. The review took 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, Elio Ferreira continued to come to work at 7 in the morning and leave at 5 in the afternoon and do his job with exactly the same precision he had always brought to it. He passed instruments to surgeons who did not know what had happened in OR3, and he passed instruments to surgeons who did know and who now looked at him with a complicated mixture of expressions he could not always read. And he treated both groups identically, which was to say professionally, and without any visible need for their acknowledgement. Leonard Hobart sent a card. It arrived at the hospital, addressed to the surgical team who helped save my life, which was how the nursing staff had described the situation to his wife when she'd asked what had happened. Inside was a handwritten note on cream-colored paper. He had drawn a small maple leaf in the corner in red ballpoint pen. The card said that he was doing well, that he had returned to Sudbury, that his wife had made him decaf for the past month, and he was almost used to it, and that he didn't have the words for what he wanted to say, but that he was sitting at his kitchen table alive, and he wanted whoever had kept him that way to know that. Colleen taped it to the wall of the supply room. Felix, who had taken several steps backward during the procedure and had spent much of the following 6 weeks reconsidering what that meant about him, read the card every morning when he came in for coffee. The college's decision arrived on a Thursday. Dr. Nguyen called Elio into his office again, which was unusual. The college communicated directly with the individual in question, but Dr. Nguyen had requested to be present when Elio was informed, and the administrator who delivered the letter had agreed. Elio read it standing up. The college had conducted a full review of the incident. They had reviewed the patient outcome, full recovery, no complications, currently 8 weeks post-operative, and attending cardiac rehabilitation in Sudbury. They had reviewed the testimony of everyone present in OR3. They had reviewed Elio's employment record, which contained 11 years of evaluations ranging from excellent to exceptional, with 0 disciplinary incidents. They had also reviewed a submission from Dr. Nguyen, which Elio had not known about, which cited Elio's technical knowledge as being, this was the phrase used, at a level consistent with advanced fellowship training. The college's finding was that Elio Ferreira had operated outside his scope of practice, in circumstances that constituted a genuine medical emergency with no qualified alternative available. They found that his actions had been technically sound, patient-centered, and, in the judgment of the reviewing committee, had directly preserved the life of the patient. His certification was not revoked. However, and this was the word in the letter that Elio read 3 times. However, the college also recommended, in the strongest possible terms, that the relevant parties consider what it meant that a person with the demonstrated competency of Elio Ferreira had spent 11 years in a role that gave him no formal pathway to use that competency. It was not an order, it was a recommendation. Those are different things in regulatory language, and Elio knew the difference. He looked up from the letter. Dr. Nguyen was watching him. "There's something else," Dr. Nguyen said. He stashed a second document across the desk. It was a letter from the University of Toronto's Faculty of Medicine. It was addressed to Elio Ferreira. It informed him that a review of his file, initiated at the request of a senior faculty member, who was not named in the letter, had resulted in the following offer: a seat in the accelerated postgraduate medical program for individuals with demonstrated exceptional clinical competency, beginning the following September, with full surgical residency consideration to follow. It was, Elio would think later, the strangest document he had ever held, not because of what it offered, but because of how long he had stopped expecting anything like it to exist. He set the letter down. "You did this," he said to Dr. Nguyen. "I submitted documentation," Dr. Nguyen said. "The faculty made their own determination." "Why?" Dr. Nguyen was quiet for a moment. He had thought about this. He had thought about it for 6 weeks, in fact, through every step of the review, through every piece of documentation, through the conversation he'd had with his wife one evening, when he'd told her the whole story, and she'd looked at him and said simply, "What are you going to do about it?" "Because you were right," Dr. Nguyen said. "You told me you'd make the same call again. And I've been in that room, not that day, but in rooms like it, and I know what it costs to make that call. And I've been thinking about what it means that you've been in that hospital for 11 years, and no one ever asked what else you knew." Elio looked at the letter on the desk. "I'm 34, he said. "The program accepts candidates up to 45. I don't have a university degree. The program has a prior learning assessment pathway. Your file has been submitted. There's a meeting in 2 weeks with the admissions committee. I'll be there." Outside the window, it was raining. The bench in the courtyard had finally been cleared. Someone had taken the coffee cup. The courtyard was empty and wet, and the light on it was the particular gray-silver of a Toronto afternoon in November, which is a color that looks bleak to people who don't know it, and familiar to people who do. Elio Ferreira picked up the letter. He did not say anything for a long moment. There was a version of this moment he knew, where he would cry, or where he would say something grateful and articulate, or where the weight of 11 years of watching and reading and knowing and being invisible would make itself felt in some visible, nameable way. Instead, he straightened the letter against the desk. He folded it along its original crease. He placed it in the breast pocket of his scrubs, the green ones, the ones with the drawstring double-knotted at the waist. "I'll need to reschedule my shift," he said. Dr. Nguyen almost smiled. "I'll arrange it." Leonard Hobart was back in his workshop by December. His daughter had sent a photograph to the hospital. She'd found the contact information for the surgical department and had mailed it to the general address with a note asking if it could be passed along to anyone who'd been involved in her father's care. In the photograph, Leonard was standing at a workbench, sawdust on his shirt, holding up a small birdhouse he'd just finished. He was grinning. He looked like a man who had been told he had time. The photograph ended up in the supply room, taped next to the card. Felix was the one who put it up. He had stopped taking steps backward. Elio started the program the following September. He was the oldest person in his intake cohort by 6 years. On the first day of orientation, one of the younger students, a 26-year-old from Vancouver, who had come directly from his undergraduate degree, asked Elio what he'd done before. It was the small talk question of first days, the one that gets asked in hallways and over coffee, the one that expects a conventional answer, Elio told him. The young man from Vancouver was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic. 11 years, 800 procedures. The OR3 incident, which the young man had read about in a medical ethics case study 3 months earlier without knowing he would one day be standing next to the person it was about. "So you already know how to do all of this," the young man said, meaning the program, the training, the years ahead. "I know some of it," Elio said. "I don't know all of it. But you saved someone's life. Yes. Before you had the credentials to do it. Yes." The young man thought about this. He had grown up in a house with 2 doctors as parents, in a neighborhood where the pathway from school to medicine was so well worn, it barely needed explaining. And he had never once considered that there might be people who arrived at competency by a completely different route, and who spent years standing at instrument tables because no one had thought to ask what they knew. "That seems wrong," the young man said finally. "It is," Elio said, "and it's also how it is." He picked up his orientation folder. Through the window of the atrium, the city was doing what Toronto does in early September, warm and golden, and full of the particular busyness of a place that is always starting something. Somewhere across the city, in a hospital on University Avenue, a man in green scrubs was passing instruments to a surgeon in blue ones, watching every movement, reading the anatomy, adding to a knowledge that the world had not yet given a name to. Elio would get there eventually. The door he was walking through had always existed. It had simply taken 11 years to find someone willing to open it. And somewhere in Sudbury, A retired shop teacher was putting a second birdhouse together, whistling to himself in a workshop that smelled like pine shavings and wood glue, listening to the CBC on a radio older than his daughter, alive, and knowing it, and not taking a single ordinary morning for granted.